Okay, good morning. Today we're going to start with another video, which is about the definition and purpose of critical thinking. So there will be a number of repetitions compared to yesterday.
The definition and purpose of critical thinking. What comes to mind when someone says that you need to use critical thinking? Do you focus on the word critical? Do you assume that thinking critically must be negative, requiring you to criticize or be critical of something you've read, heard, or watched? The modules you will complete in this course will help you understand what critical thinking is and how you can do it. As we go through this module, you will learn that thinking critically should not be assumed to be synonymous with criticizing. Once you learn to think critically, you might criticize an argument or claim, but your thinking will be thoughtfully reasoned consideration, not reflexive, quick, and unthinking judgment. In the concept of critical thinking, the term critical refers to a way of thinking, an analytical stance you take with regards to assessing claims that you've read, heard, or saw. In this module, we will explain the concept and activity of critical thinking. 1. We will construct a useful, everyday definition of critical thinking and identify what critical thinking is not. And 2. Show you the purpose and value of critical thinking. According to one definition, critical thinking is the careful application of reason in the determination of whether a claim is true. Another definition holds that critical thinking is judicious reasoning about what to believe and therefore what to do. Let's note the important pieces of these definitions. Critical thinking requires 1. Careful, intentional thinking, also known as judiciousness. 2. The use of reason or logic. 3. Judgment about beliefs. And finally, 4. Application to real-world problems and issues. Let's walk through these one by one. Careful and intentional. First, consider the ideas of being careful and judicious. Critical thinking is not a fast or easy process, even if you know how to do it. To do it properly requires you to take your time. Being careful and judicious require you to be purposeful and deliberate in your evaluation. It also requires you to be thorough. To think critically, you have to focus on the issue at hand, taking in all its complexity, breadth, and depth. Critical thinking is not passive. The goal of critical thinking is not simply to decide whether to accept or reject an argument, to register a yay or nay vote. In critical thinking, the goal is to fully evaluate all parts of a claim that someone has made, to assess each of its parts as well as the whole. Certainly, there are relatively easy black and white cases. For example, consider the claim that was made in the day of Columbus, when people said, ships sailing east from Europe will eventually fall into space because the Earth is flat. You don't need to be an expert in critical thinking to see this as an example of an argument that's pretty easy to reject in total, assuming you know the Earth is not flat. However, much more often, we are asked to think critically about more complex, challenging claims or arguments that contain much more gray than they do black or white. So in such cases, it's much harder to say, I agree, or I disagree. Critical thinking is the logical process that you go through to determine whether you agree or not. Critical thinking allows you to explain why you disagree, what parts of the claim or argument you find wrong or troubling, and even what argument you might make in its place. As we proceed in learning about critical thinking, you'll find that by offering alternatives to the argument, you and others involved strengthen and clarify views and positions. Thus, critical thinking can be seen as an exercise in collective problem solving. Throughout these critical thinking modules, you will be asked to take what you learn and apply it in class. That means thinking critically about what you're reading, as well as claims made by your professor and classmates. Sometimes, you will have to critically evaluate claims made by others. Other times, you'll be asked to actively defend your own claims, which will require you to think critically about your own perspectives and positions. Critical thinking is not a process that most people do in their daily activities, but it's important to both your understanding of what other people say and what you think and say to others. At times, you may struggle to use the critical thinking process, and that's okay. Number 2, reason or logic. So, critical thinking is an active process meant to move us, whether it's a class or another community that you belong to, towards greater understanding of difficult economic, social, ethical, and legal problems. In order to do this effectively, critical thinking requires applying reason. Over the next few modules, we will examine more deeply reason. We will develop yardsticks for assessing whether an argument is a product of good, thoughtful reasoning. We will compare reason with other ways of judging or reacting to claims. For example, people often make decisions based on pure emotion, intuition, faith, or common sense. Utilizing reason does not necessarily mean throwing these sensibilities, emotion, intuition, etc., out the window. It's not cold, hard, or unfeeling. But critical thinking requires putting these other ways of thinking and reacting under the microscope of reason. For example, many people decide not to try certain activities because they say, "I'm too scared. I can't go running tonight. I don't have anyone else to run with, and I'm afraid of running by myself at night." Fear, like all emotions, can either be justified or unfounded. When we expose this emotional response to reason, we can determine whether it's justified or not. Are there good reasons to be fearful of running alone at night? Is the area known for crime? Are there wild animals or dogs to worry about? Is it easy to get lost? By asking these kinds of questions, we can probe to see whether our emotion, fear, is the product of a reasonable assessment of the situation. 3 and 4, judgments and application. Finally, let's consider these last 2 pieces of the definition of critical thinking, determining whether a claim is true and deciding how to act based on that determination. These speak to the purpose of critical thinking. When we engage in critical thinking, our goal is to determine whether the claim before us is true or not, and then to use that assessment to decide what action or actions to take. Ultimately, when we are asked to think critically, we are being asked to take a position regarding the truth or acceptability of something we've read, heard, or watched. While the exercise of critical thinking is not biased toward one outcome or the other, in the end, we are expected to have a reasoned judgment about whether we disagree or agree with a claim or argument. So why do we need to take a position or pass judgment? Let's consider the following scenario. One of your classes requires students to complete a group project worth 50% of their final grade. You're put into a group with 4 other students. At your first meeting, one of your group members says, "Listen, I've done this whole group project thing before, and it's a real pain in the butt. Nobody really likes working with other people, and we all just end up fighting anyway. It's too hard to split up the parts of the project. No one's ever happy with their part. Last time I had to do one of these things, we decided that each of us would just do the whole project. Then we shared our reports and voted on the best one. That's the one we turned into the professor. We should do the same thing for this class." Is this a good argument? Do you agree with all of the claims he made? Do those claims necessarily lead to his conclusion about how to handle the project? Should you go along with your classmate? Or is there a better way to handle the project? Remember, 50% of your final grade is at stake here. Your classmate has had certain experiences that make him believe that doing group project work separately as individuals is better than dividing up the tasks among the group. If you simply accept his belief without question, without thinking about it critically, you may come to share his belief simply as an inherited opinion. An inherited opinion means that you believe completing group projects this way is better because someone else told you it was better. Now, many of us hold inherited opinions on a lot of topics. Frequently, our political, moral, and ethical beliefs have been handed down to us by our families or communities. How many of us could actually provide evidence or reasons for those beliefs if asked to do so? But we are often required to do just that. We live in a diverse, complicated world in which people hold widely different views on many topics. Individuals, communities, businesses, and governments need to decide what to do on many issues that are the subject of strong disagreements. Critical thinking will help us both offer reasons for our own positions on what action should be taken and effectively evaluate the reasons offered by others. To see how important critical thinking can be, consider this scenario. You are working as a marketing assistant for a marketing company. You've been in that position for a few years and you're looking to catch the attention of your supervisor. You know there's a marketing manager position opening up soon and you've got your eye on it. You want to distinguish yourself. Fortunately, an opportunity presents itself. Your supervisor asks both you and your coworker, who's also an assistant, what you think the company should focus on for an upcoming ad campaign. Should they invest more resources in traditional marketing venues like print and TV ads, for example, or in innovative online and social media venues? Wanting to seem like you're on top of things and ready to go, you respond quickly with an email. Definitely traditional venues, and here's how we should spend the money in those venues. Your coworker doesn't respond right away, but the next day offers her assessment. We should go with online and social media. I've attached a detailed report showing recent trends in market research with data that demonstrates the increased return on investment of social media marketing campaigns compared with traditional venues. Who do you think will get the attention of the supervisor? The employee who made an unsupported claim about what to do, you, or the employee who offered evidence and reason for her position? Taking the time to assess beliefs and opinions, to think critically about them, gives us insight and understanding that we would not have developed without critical thinking. Insight and understanding leads to justification for taking or not taking certain actions. But it also gives us ownership over our beliefs. As we think critically about our own and others' beliefs, we develop the skills that allow us to know why we believe what we believe. We can offer evidence and reason to defend our beliefs, and that reason giving leads us to actions that fit with our beliefs. Ultimately, we have true freedom of thought and opinion that comes when we know what we believe and why. This module has provided you with a working definition of critical thinking. You should now be able to explain what critical thinking is and how it's different from other types of thought. You should understand the key features of critical thinking and to appreciate its purpose and value.
Okay. This is actually the first of a number of videos that's prepared by the same person. And we already have the website where you can find the others. So you are not going to be responsible for the others, of course, but if you are interested in the topic, I think there are at least 10 or 12 more videos that actually follows this one. I think it's a very clearly prepared video. It doesn't contain a lot of information, but it's very precise, and I think you may want to make use of it. Okay. Let me now, let's see. Okay. Okay, so let me show the last slide of the notes that you have from yesterday, because this is actually, this is going to conclude what we think about the topic. Now, we have seen a number of things about critical thinking, and critical thinking abilities are of utmost importance for all university graduates, but it is also true for IEs as well. And the reason that we actually are more interested, because we claim that IEs are technical supporters for decision-making processes. So if we're talking about decision-making processes, then of course critical thinking abilities are utmost important compared to more routine technical disciplines that are around. Now, modeling real life includes others' opinion and their possible biases. Now, the systems that we are dealing, think about the traffic system. We are concerned, we might be concerned from different aspects for different people. We might have concerns about them. And so if we want to model it and if we want to create a possible approach for that, we have to make sure that we understand what the other's opinions are, and we have to understand what their biases are. Okay, so in that respect, it is very important for us to be able to understand verbal or written statements and to evaluate whether they are unbiased or if they have any biases to understand their sources. Now, the context that you are going to handle is important. In other words, the problem owner, who is the decision maker? In the traffic example, we might have different decision makers, but who is the decision maker in your own context is also very important. Now, if you are making a decision for yourself, it is also going to be simple because you are going to reflect yourself on that decision, like the ranking when you are selecting universities. However, if we are going to work for somebody else and try to help that person or that community to decide on something, we have to understand the sentiments, the biases, and the opinions that will go into their decision making so that we can support them. So you can see that the idea of critical thinking is not necessarily for yourself, but you are doing it for other people, other groups of people, or other individual who is going to make a decision at a certain circumstance. So this is actually what our role is. Our role is to support decision-making processes of others, which might be a community, which might be an organization, which might be a single decision maker, and that's the role that we have as an engineering discipline. So that's the reason why it's very important that we understand this critical thinking notion. Okay, now today what we're going to do, on the other hand, is we're going to go one step beyond that, because critical thinking seems to be something that is mostly around your brain functions. In other words, you try to understand something, you try to evaluate something, but probably the complexities of the world that we have is going to ask you to go beyond critical thinking ideas. Beyond meaning that we are going to apply the same idea, of course, but now the complexities that we have to deal with are more. So this is what we're going to see today with a few examples, and then I will end up with a rather simple example to show why we should think about the limitations that are presented to us. Okay, so let me start with, so this is the idea of system or systems and systems thinking. Now, of course, as we go beyond the notion of critical thinking, things are going to get a little bit clumsy and somehow philosophical. So my intention is not, of course, to teach that, but just to make you aware that we have these type of problematics that we need to deal when we are solving a real-life problem. Okay, now, definition of, let me start with, it would be a little bit boring in the beginning, but then I will give a large number of examples. Okay, so let's start with the definition of a system. This presentation is usually mostly taken from D'Alembert and McNichol. You already have that in your reading list. Now, an organized collection, a system is an organized collection of things or components which may be called subsystems that does something, it has a purpose, and exhibits behaviors that none of its components exhibits individually. In other words, we have a number of components coming together. Each of them functions, has some kind of a function. But when you look at the system as a whole, it is going to exhibit something as an output. And that something is not an individual subsystem's output. So you have collectively, you have more output than what the output of each individual. Okay, that's called a system. Now, when you look at any real organization, you have a number of different departments in those organizations. think about a sports club, for example. It's an organization. It has a number of different parts. Think about, let's say, Fenerbahçe Sports Club. Okay? It has a number of different divisions in it. They have football division, amateur sport division, athletics, or volleyball, or basketball. And you can see that the output of each of them is not necessarily the output of the club itself, because the club is getting a large number of championships, but not necessarily in the part that we mostly know, which is football. Okay? There are other parts of Fenerbahçe which supports a large number of sports people, and it helps the whole environment to enrich. So you can see that the system itself is more than what you are seeing individually from different divisions. Okay? And it has a name that is associated with that. Now, Fenerbahçe is a good example because they have been very active in putting social people together for other purposes other than sports as well. So that's the reason why I gave that example. Whether you like it or not, I personally don't like it, but it is something that basically is more than what the individual divisions are doing. That's a system. Okay? So the system has an environment that it operates within. So Fenerbahçe Sport Club has the Turkish environment and the world sports environment that it's operating in. And it goes actually beyond that. It is now operating in the political arena as well, okay, partly, as a club. It has some boundaries, of course. They cannot do demonstrations elsewhere, but only in Ankara and in Istanbul, okay? And there are certain limitations. They don't deal with every sports. They have selected certain branches of sports that they are going to operate. So they have some boundaries. The input to the club, to the organization, is coming from everywhere. Individuals are fans, journalists, famous people, politicians, and moreover, knowledge is also coming to the club through the ways of different trainers and different experts. You have a lot of knowledge coming in the from financial markets, because it's basically an organization that sells its shares in the market. Now, there are lots of input that comes from that system. And of course, some of them are going to be the inputs that we are going to make decision for. So you are sitting as the club chairman, and you have a number of things that you can control. You cannot very much control what other people is doing for Fenerbahçe, but you can control, for example, who is going to be the trainer for the basketball team. You can control certain other things. There are certain decisions that you can make, but not necessarily all the input is going to be controllable, because it is basically operating within the environment and it has some relations with the environment. Then we have the output. Output is going to be what? Well, the number of times that it takes the attention of media is one output, but the championships are the other output, or the success level is another output. But you can see that there are various different types of output that you may want to measure. Of course, for certain input types, if we are going to make the decision, we want to control the output level. So we want to hire somebody who is going to bring championships to the football team, so we pay a little bit more. Or basically, we try to make some balance, but now you can think that within this whole organization, the decision about selecting the coach of the basketball team is only a little piece of something. There is this huge organization is going on. This is the idea that comes together with systems thinking. Okay? Now, of course, our decision is to select the coach for the basketball team, but however, we have to understand that we are deciding for this whole organization. There are lots of interactions, and our decision should follow certain input that we receive from that whole environment. So you can see that what I am doing is I am increasing the complexity level of that decision. making sure that we understand what's going on around. Now, sometimes we would not be able to understand what's going on around, and I will have some examples for that. So basically, this is environment, boundary, input, output. State of the system is the current situation of the system. What is the financial position? How many points the football team has? Or how many fans do they have? What is the market value in the İstanbul Menkul Kıymetler Borsası? Okay, in the Wall Street of Turkey, and so on and so forth. Okay, so for an IE-OR system, on the other hand, we even have more difficulties because most of the things that I talked about, some of the things that I talked about was physical. Okay, we have some infrastructure, papers going on, but most of the IE-OR systems that you are going to deal, seeing something is not necessarily going to be physical. We are also going to look at the mental construct that we have around it. I think a very good example is the traffic system. Now, we know that there is a traffic system going on. Whether you may like to call it system or not, that's not an issue. It is a system, actually. The inputs are varying, but if we are going to, let's say, going to build an underpass somewhere in Ankara, okay? Now, you can see that it's going to affect everything. So are you going to model the whole traffic system just to make a decision for that? Probably not. So what you do is you construct mentally a traffic system for which you think that decision is going to affect only. So this is what we do. We mentally construct, we take the real system, but what we do is we mentally construct a pseudo system. Pseudo means, do you know the meaning of pseudo? Pseudo is sort of something that mimics the real thing. Okay? It's not necessarily the real thing. Like some animals which do not have limbs, they will have pseudo limbs. It will mimic the effect of a limb so that they are going to use it when they are moving. Okay? That's called pseudo. It's not the real thing, but it is the construct that mimics it. Okay. So in that respect, we're going to have a pseudo traffic system that we are going to model. This is what we do, actually. So that's the reason why we have a lot of mental process that we need to come up with before we can solve certain real-life problems. Of course, not every problem is going to be very difficult. We're going to use mental constructs of others to solve the problem. They will be more structured. But if you want to solve a problem which is very specific and so on, you need to have these type of issues. Of course, when you have these mental constructs, or what we call conceptualization, human conceptualization, then things become a little bit subjective. So the way that you are going to mentally construct certain things might be different than somebody else's construction. So you have to make sure that you convey the information on how you construct, what are your boundaries, what is your environment, so on and so forth. So I am not going to talk about this, but what I would advise you to do is when you start having some project work in your courses, come back to this specific reference and try to read what they are saying. I think it will make more sense when you have a specific problem available. Okay. Now, what is systems thinking then? Well, we understand what system is. System thinking is study of processes in terms of their systematic properties and roles. Something is viewed as an interdependent part of a larger whole, which is called a system. So systems thinking is simply understanding that the part that you want to deal is a part of a certain whole. Okay? And you have to understand the interrelations between that part and the whole. This is a little bit more comprehensive and deeper than critical thinking, of course, and it's more complex. And a result of complexity, it is basically a result of the increased complexity, and also at the same time as a result of the way that we reduce things to smaller parts. Remember in the beginning of the semester, I told you that we, as engineers, we would like to reduce problems into smaller problems so that we can solve those problems. I don't want to think about the possibilities of world coming to an end when I'm constructing something. But I know that there is a possibility of a nuclear war, which might be far away. But if I am doing something, shouldn't I do that? I'm going to build a house for myself. But if I start thinking that what happens if there is this third world war, and what happens if there is a nuclear attack? So there are certain constructs that we assume. It is part of what I know, of course, but it's not going to affect my decision. Now, engineers like to reduce problems in that sense. But of course, there are certain complexities around which might which might result in this reductionist view to be too narrow. Okay? So as an intellectual, as a person who is a graduate of university, we have to understand that there are some limitations of that approach. Okay? So this is basically systems thinking is an approach or the idea of being very careful about the limitations of the process that you thought you systematically have done. Okay? And because there is this larger world which is around the problem environment that you already defined. Okay, so this is more or less, it's not easy to follow. It is, I mean, there is a lot of philosophy behind this, so you have to read some philosophical papers as well in order to understand what is the meaning of reductionism and so on. But what I will do is I will take the easy way out. I'll try to explain it with some examples. Now, first of all, some examples of the increased complexity in the world. This wasn't probably available up there 300 years ago. But at this point, in our current world, we have increased complexity. We have the issue of globalization. We are all familiar with the word globalization. But what is globalization making is that even if I am growing a small produce here in my garden, there is an influence of that to what's happening all around the world, because I am using certain chemicals, and the use of those chemicals, if very successful, is going to change everything that will be around the world. Now, 300 years ago, nobody would be able to hear about that. But I have this small garden that I'm using some specific approach to obtain produce. But it might affect the world at some point in time. Now, other things is that instead of growing banana in my garden, now I can think of buying it from equator. Now, 100 years ago, I wouldn't think about that. I mean, how am I going to bring bananas from equator? But nowadays, the banana that we eat are coming from equator. So this globalization is making certain things possible now. So the problems, the environment that we would like to draw around the problem or the boundaries is actually larger than we think. Now, let's say that you have very good intentions and you want to manufacture something in Turkey. Okay, we always have those type of titles in the newspapers. We want to manufacture something in Turkey. Now, there is no meaning in manufacturing certain things in Turkey unless you have a completely different way of manufacturing, because it will be more expensive. It's so obvious. Nobody is going to buy it from you. Or you're going to lose some money just for the sake of preparing something for the future, if that's the case. But if you want to make a profit right now, it will be impossible. Because, I mean, producing it in China and assembling everything in Malaysia and bringing to Turkey is much cheaper. Now we know about this. Well, in 1950s and 60s, we didn't know about that because there wasn't this globalization. So this is making the problems very complex. You have to come out of your box and try to solve those problems in that way. Being innovative is becoming very difficult now because of this globalization, unfortunately. Okay, so this is the idea of globalization. Now, similarly, multinational corporations. Now, up to this time, we thought that, okay, there were some forces who is working for a certain country, and those forces were forcing some nationalities to trade only from specific countries. Now, that is lost. Most of the largest firms around the world are multinationals. Even sitting here in your classroom, you can own a part of these multinational companies. You can simply buy their shares. Okay? So this is creating a huge complexity, because now the previous norms that we had about security, the previous norms that we had about a country being powerful is practically lost, can be lost. It may not be still, but it's lost. So the effect of this is different. You rely on some tax income to do something, for education. But the tax income comes from multinationals, mostly, and they can easily shift that income to another country by changing the way that they are doing certain business, if they think it's profitable. So overnight, you might be losing a lot of income as a country. And this makes the problem very difficult. Now, 40 years ago, we would do devaluation, devalue the Turkish lira against dollars, or revalue Turkish lira against dollars, and that will solve most of the problems. Nowadays, it doesn't mean anything, okay? It doesn't mean anything because you have all these interactions coming from globalization and multinational operations. Now, again, same thing is true for economic crisis. Who cares there is an economic crisis in Iceland? It turns out that we care about that because of these ties. Anything that happens there is affecting us. And if you are vulnerable, if you are weaker, it is going to affect you more than it is affecting some other countries. And finally, environmental issues. Most part of these environmental issues we're not aware. We still don't know. Our knowledge is not sufficient. So I am doing something here. I am cutting the trees in Ankara. What is the effect of cutting natural trees in Ankara over the ecosystem of Turkey or even the whole region? They are changing the ecosystem in Abu Dhabi. Deserts were there all the time. Now there are no deserts. They did the same thing in Palm Springs, California. 50 years ago, Palm Springs was desert. Arizona was desert. Nowadays, you don't see desert. You have to travel 2 hours to see a little piece of desert. Now, how that is going to affect the whole ecosystem has some clues, but we still don't know it. And my first example comes from this type of an environmental issue. Now, this is the first example of the complexities and the decisions that were made. Now, in the beginning of the 20th century, I don't recall the exact date. It might be in your notes. There is this so-called very high dam which is built in Egypt, Aswan. In Turkish, we call it Aswan. Okay, instead of W, we write S, another S and U, Aswan. Okay, this dam was the largest in the world. And the reason that it was built was Nile is a very rich and prosperous river. We all know Nile. And so, and Egypt had a lot of water problems, especially inlands. If you go beyond Nile, around Nile it was always very good. But if you go beyond Nile, they had a number of problems with respect to water and rains. Number one, they wanted to control the flow of water because it was flooding all the time. Secondly, they wanted to generate electricity using the powerful Nile. Okay? And at that point in time, everybody thought that this was the best thing that can happen to Egypt. And Egypt actually had a lot of benefits coming from this dam. And they still have some benefits coming. But one thing that was missed at the time is that in almost 50 years after the dam was built, the prosperity of the areas around Nile, which is like historically it's a very prosperous area around Nile. You have a large number of producers that can be produced there. They have different products that are unique. For example, the best cotton in the world comes from that area. Okay, it's called Egyptian cotton, and it is the highest quality cotton around the world. Now, what happened in 50 years after that dam was built is that the prosperity of the land around Nile started to go down. And then they were able to understand that the floods that were prevented was very helpful with respect to keeping the land prosperous for a long term. And when they prevented that, it turns out that the land is no more prosperous. Now, when this was built in 1920s, 30s, 40s, nobody was able to foresee this. That will happen in 40 years. So you can see that this is actually what I'm talking about as systems perspective. Now, we didn't have the knowledge at the time, of course, but we were only concerned with the electric energy that we are going to get out of that land and the benefits that we're going to have by preventing floods. That was the only concern, and it turned out to be a very successful project with respect to those two expectations. But something else came out, and that's because basically the boundaries of that project was limited to those concerns only. They didn't think about what would happen if we built this huge dam. How is it going to change the ecosystem? There was no mention of that, okay, at that time. So nowadays, if you are going to build a dam like this, you have to be more careful because we know a little bit more. Plus, we can now understand the relation between ecosystem and the dam itself. So this is what I'm talking about systems approach. Now, if you leave the decision of the Aswan High Dam to industrial engineers, civil engineers, and politicians, this was probably a very good decision. But now we understand that we need to go actually beyond that and to explain certain things. Okay, now, oh, this is repeated again, so I think it's so important. Now, you can read more in the text that I gave you, or you can simply Google Aswan High Dam, and you're going to find a lot of information about that. Now, another example is the urban transport example. Now, in 1950s in Turkey, there was this main decision that was made. Actually, it wasn't in Turkey, because we simply took that decision from the US in 1950s. There were two choices to deal with the urban transport problem. Either we would build road networks, more road networks, or we would use public transport. Okay? So this was the same thing in most cities of the United States in 1950s. So now this decision turns out to be quite important. When the cities became populated, it becomes harder actually to obtain public transport or to build public transport systems. So the best thing to do is you should build them before it's too late. Otherwise, it becomes too expensive to build. So what you have to do is you have to go down deep because there are all apartments all around. Now, this is something that was not very easy to see. I'm not blaming anybody for any reason, but this is basically one of the problems that we are having all around the world, not only in Turkey, about the traffic problems in urban cities. But there are very large populated areas around the world which does not have this problem, because they usually have their mass transport system built in early 20th century. Okay, they are having this problem, of course, but with 3 times of the population of the comparable cities. So this is something which is extremely important. And so what's happening is that at that point in time, upgrading road network was the main priority because everybody was able to see that driving cars individually would bring better citizens because they will be very happy. Individualistically, you are supporting that person, which is, I think, very important because that's how you get innovative people, so on and so forth. So this is very important. But at the same time, you have to make sure that the places that they live together are still going to be livable in the foreseeable future. So this is still a dilemma. I don't know how to solve it. So if you ask me, if you have 100 Turkish liras, how much are you going to spend for the public transport and how much are you going to spend for upgrading the road network? I still don't know the answer to that question. Okay, this is a difficult question and you cannot look at in a very simplistic way. You have to look at the effects that it has around. Okay, so this is what we mean by systems thinking. It is a little bit beyond critical thinking, and we're going to see actually a number of other examples after the break. Questions? Okay, let's take a break now.